I have the very, very real privilege of introducing to you Alison Davis, who's on the stage now to my right. She's the National Coordinator of the UK Disability Advocacy Group No Less Human, and she also runs Enable, a charity which supports disabled children in India. Members of No Less Human do whatever they can to promote a positive view of disability. They speak at public meetings in many venues around the United Kingdom, and they also regularly speak on behalf of disabled people in the UK media. The aim of No Less Human is to promote greater understanding of the needs of disabled people and to educate people about the threats to disabled lives. These threats often come in the form of the attitudes of others rather than the actual disability itself, which can cause many problems for disabled people. Alison suffers from spina bifida, hydrocephalus, emphysema, arthritis, lordosis, kyphoscoliosis and osteoporosis, and she relies on the full-time use of a wheelchair. Yet despite these difficulties, which cause her much suffering, she remains a strong opponent of any attempt to normalise or legalise euthanasia. 20 years ago, things were much different for Alison, and during this period, her desire to die became so overwhelming that she attempted to take her own life on many occasions over a number of years. It was only the love and support of friends who were insistent that every life has great value and purpose, which changed Alison's bleak outlook and led her to realise that her own life really was worth living. Today, Alison will be sharing insights from her personal story with us, as well as exploring the great threat that legalised euthanasia presents to individuals and societies. And just on a personal note, last night, when we were at Mass, I could see, on the other side of the church, I could see Alison after communion time, and I could see just, there was a great love, a look of adoration as she literally was staring at the cross in silent prayer. And it really struck me what a profound image and witness to the suffering Christ that Alison you are, and the great love that you have for the cross is very evident, and you can just see it. So it's very beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and extend a warm welcome to the very courageous and different culture of life, Alison Davis.
Okay. Can anyone not hear? Well, if you can't hear me, you're not going to hear me say, "Can you not hear me?" Is the volume okay? Is the volume okay? Yeah, okay. I was going to start by telling a joke about New Zealand, or about New Zealand people and what they think about English people. But I looked on the internet and there was nothing really appropriate. So I decided instead that I'd tell you something about people from Dorset, which is where I'm from, a small county in the southwest of England. So I looked through various old newspapers and bits and pieces that I kept, and this is a few things that I gleaned from it, just very short, just to give you an idea what we're like. Here's one. A job centre has been told that it cannot advertise for hard-working staff because that would discriminate against people who are unwilling to work hard. So you see, we don't work hard. Similar vein, a travel agency had to withdraw its advert for a friendly caterer because it would discriminate against people who are unfriendly. Oh, this is one of my favourites. A new disability benefit has been announced. Anyone who's disabled and aged 116 or over can apply. The next bit is so good. There is no upper age limit. So we're full of misprints, but this is my favourite for. A man who flouted a ban on being drunk in public escaped jail because of a grammatical blunder. Stephen Winston, 38, couldn't be convicted of breaching his antisocial behaviour order because the clerk who drew it up stated that he was prohibited from not being drunk in public. So you see the kind of people we are. We don't work hard, we're unfriendly, we live a long time, but the disability benefits don't kick in till we're 116. And well, we're supposed to be drunk in public, not only allowed to be drunk in public. Anyway, an aside, but I just wanted to tell you about Dorset people. So, before I found out the real title of my talk, I started giving it thought, and I decided that I was going to think of it in 3 sections, 3 changes of mind. And of course, most people change their minds several times a day. mostly about trivial things, and of course I do too. But today I'm going to speak about 3 changes of mind which have been respectively serious, life-changing and life-saving. Brendan has already explained the various disabilities I have. I attended a mainstream school, which was tough, not always a happy experience, but I got a good education despite a lot of hospital stays. And after school I went to university. Has to be said, I partied more than I studied. But my course was interrupted by one very long hospital stay. I missed a term of my second year. But anyway, I was used to catching up. That was no problem. I was brought up in the United Reformed Church. I'm not sure if you have it here in New Zealand. It's a kind of very low church, Protestant, evangelical sort of church. But while I was at university, I decided I no longer believed in God, or indeed any other aspect of Christian teaching, though the United Reformed Church is not very hot on teaching, I have to say. I think it's difficult. Well, it's not really difficult, it's just embarrassing to say that I gave up on God so easily because I wanted to live the kind of lifestyle that wasn't constrained by rules. I wanted to live a lifestyle that I knew was incompatible with what I'd been taught at school. I got married halfway through my course at the age of 20, and my husband was then 19. We'd been living as if married for about 2 years. I was using contraception. And between us, we tried very hard to find happiness without God. So my first change of mind was about killing unborn children. At university, I was a very keen member of the women's rights group. I supported a woman's right to choose on abortion, which of course was a key aim of the group. I took part in many marches. I carried banners saying rude things about pro-lifers. And I think, in retrospect, the main motivation for doing that was that I wanted to preserve my right, as I saw it, to have an abortion if I felt I needed one. I suppose I saw abortion as a let-out if the contraception I was using failed. Most of my friends were supporters of what we called the right to choose, and it was considered pretty much the natural thing to do. I left university then, and I carried on supporting what I called abortion rights. I was still desperately trying to find happiness without acknowledging any sort of supernatural power at all. And it was about then that I noticed a decided trend in dealing with newborn babies with disabilities, particularly spina bifida. I read in The Guardian, which is a national UK newspaper, that Dr. Donald Garrow, a doctor at a hospital in southeast England, had a patient called Louise who had spina bifida and hydrocephalus, the same disabilities I have. And he deliberately killed her by sedating her so she was too sleepy to cry for food, so she never cried, she wasn't fed, and she died. He appeared in a television programme, and he'd prepared a video of Louise's last days, and you could see that her face was green to grey, her arms were stick-thin, her legs were stick-thin, but her stomach was bloated. The kind of pictures we've all seen of children in the developing world who are suffering from malnutrition or starvation. Dr. Garrow explained on the TV programme quite casually that she eventually died of a combination of infection, which we weren't treating, dehydration and starvation. Quite openly, quite naturally, and he said it was the loving thing to do because Louise would have been unable to walk and doubly incontinent, as indeed I am, and she would have compared herself unfavourably with her able-bodied sisters. The story also appeared in the press, and I was very angry about it. I cut out various cuttings from the press, and I kept them, but for the time being, I didn't do anything much about it. I read several other articles in the following 2 years about babies with spina bifida or Down syndrome, and I found that it was actually quite common for doctors to specify what they termed non-treatment, but what they actually meant was not feeding and not giving water. One doctor, Professor John Lorber, was actually very prominent in medical circles at that time, and he proposed 5 criteria for deciding whether a baby with spina bifida should be allowed to die or pushed into death. And a baby who failed even one of the criteria would qualify for death, as he put it. I would have failed 3 of his criteria, so obviously I would have qualified. He admitted in a medical paper, there are babies we do not operate on because we want those babies dead. That is absolutely clear. So he thought there was no problem at all in stating exactly what was in his mind. I was really, really angry, splutteringly angry, I called it, because I couldn't think of any other way to describe it. And eventually I wrote to the same newspaper, The Guardian, and I naively thought, well, that'll get it off my chest and I'll be able to think about other things, get on with my life then and not have to worry about it anymore. But actually that wasn't to be. I was contacted by individuals and groups of all shades of opinion. I think about 100 letters arrived in the week following that letter that I had in The Guardian. And one of those was from the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, the major pro-life group in the UK. And I read the material they sent me with the preconceived idea that it would be a load of rubbish and that it wouldn't be well documented, it wouldn't be scientifically proven, and that I could soon dismiss it. For me, they were the enemy, of course, because I was in favour of abortion. But as I read it, I became more and more sure, with a very uncomfortable sureness, that what they were saying was actually true, and that it actually did have the utmost relevance to me. And I felt a growing concern that the moment of birth couldn't possibly be such a cut-off point that it separated the status of those before birth and the status of those after birth. That a change of venue, for instance, a change of the baby's situation, could make such a difference to the rights of the individual. But because my rapidly changing view was based on what I regarded as the rights of myself and those I identified as being like me, disabled people, for a while I held the ridiculous view that it was okay to abort a baby on social grounds but not a baby on disability grounds. I suppose my idea was that it was wrong to kill a baby for its specific characteristics, but okay to kill a baby just because you didn't want him. Absolutely ridiculous. Didn't hold up to any examination whatsoever. And finally, and I have to say reluctantly, I accepted the truth that killing any baby was wrong. And I was to learn very shocking facts very soon after I changed my mind on abortion. I found out that 90% of babies with spina bifida are aborted now in the UK, and 92% of babies with Down syndrome. So the extent of our struggle and our campaign is clear just from those basic statistics. I also learned that the British government had produced large volumes of cost-benefit analyses showing how it was much cheaper to kill us than to care for us. And those sorts of calculations have continued to be made since then. Even in the last couple of years, the same sort of arguments have been presented in medical journals. So by 1983, I was working as coordinator of SPUC's newly formed handicap division, as it was called then. It subsequently, of course, changed its mind to No Less Human. And No Less Human is a group for disabled people, families and carers, and we promote the equal right to life of disabled people from conception to natural death. I'm just going to take a drink and then I'll get on to my second change of mind. Okay, so my second change of mind, which was becoming a Catholic. In May 1985, a bombshell hit me when my husband left me very suddenly, very unexpectedly. Suffice it to say, I was largely responsible for it, and I have no criticism of him, had no criticism of him then and don't now. But his departure was a major blow, and the mental suffering developing from it was acute, was very deep and long-lasting. My friends rallied around as much as they could, but I saw only a black hole, and some of the story of that time I'll tell during the third section of this talk. When my husband left, I began to realise just how much I'd relied on him. And that winter, the first winter after he left, was the coldest for 20 years, and my house got snowed in. My friends had to come and dig me out. They had to get the ice off. Icicles were forming on the house. They had to come and dig me out. I had no money. All my disability benefits were withdrawn because my husband was my carer. So once he left, I had no disability benefits. Wasn't working then, so had no money. I can recall through the mental haze eating nothing but boiled potatoes and bread because that was all I could afford, and that was all I could afford for several months. My home was heated by open coal fires, couldn't afford coal, so I can remember trying to carry on working for Spark Typing with gloves on, listening to the phone with a woolly hat on because I was cold, I was hungry, and sounds rather melodramatic actually, but it's actually true. This was the way it was. Slowly my mind started to go back to the Christianity I had embraced as a child. I didn't actually think I wanted to be a Christian again. I'd had some bad times with Christians in the past, and so I looked elsewhere for the truth. I read the holy books of many other religious groups. I read the Muslim Quran, the Hindu sacred scriptures, the Buddhist classics, and I found them all fascinating, and I felt they all had something of the truth, but not all of the truth. None of them really satisfied me. And it was then I began to wonder, really very reluctantly, whether perhaps Christianity had it after all. My good friend and colleague Ian Brown, who went on to be a minister of the Anglican Church, suggested I read the Bible, and I misunderstood what he meant. What he meant was read some portion of it every day. What I did was read the whole thing from start to finish, which was not a bad thing. It took me a long time. But as I read, I began to think it all hung together, and actually just perhaps it was true. So during the year 1986, I went to Scotland to stay for a few weeks with a priest who had been a friend of mine through SBUC for quite a few years. And it was him who first taught me to say the Rosary. Wasn't a Catholic, but I immediately loved it and felt the presence of a true mother in Mary. My own mother had not been particularly supportive to me over the years. But I didn't become a Catholic still. After I left Scotland, one of the priest's helpers came to stay with me to be a carer for a while. And she'd pray, and at first I'd just listen or join in with the Rosary. We went to church, and to the Catholic Church, obviously. And there I met with the priest, Father John McGrath, who was to become a good friend of mine also. And sometimes after Mass we would sit with him after Mass, literally under the eye of the statue of Our Lady. And he would answer all the questions I had, and I'm sure most of them were terribly mundane and something everybody else in the world but me knew. But he was never impatient or dismissive of what my questions were. And again in his church I felt a certain something inexpressible that I'd first felt in the chapel in Scotland. And just when things started to look up, my carer went to London for the day and never came back. So another desertion. And she'd been with me nearly a year, but I never found out why she didn't come back. I'm sure, she had her reasons. But obviously so followed the darkest days of my whole life. I questioned my sanity, my ability to live alone, either with or without a carer. And through all the chaos, I continued to work for Spark. And nobody really knew how desperate or how low I was. Finally, at last, another Scottish friend called Joe came to live with me. He became my carer, and he was an atheist, but he'd been brought up a Catholic. And I continued to pray, think about God. I came to the conclusion I had to be a Christian, despite the fact I didn't really want to be. But I couldn't yet discover what sort of Christian I was going to be, and that was my next quest. Father McGrath then invited Joe and me to join his parish pilgrimage to Lourdes, which is a Marian shrine in France. I'm sure everyone knows about it here. And I felt completely at one with the sick and disabled people there. I felt I belonged. But I wasn't still not really ready to join the Catholic Church. And looking back, I think the main reason was my divorce. I was afraid that I would be judged harshly. I knew that the church didn't allow a divorce, and I thought it might be a sticking point. And in point of fact, unfortunately, it did prove to be a source of suffering for me, but that's another story for another time. Joe and I finally moved to Dorset. I'd been living in another area in the southeast of England, and of course you've heard I now live in Dorset, where all the funny things happen and the funny people live. And still feeling the fear about how divorced people might be treated in the Catholic Church, I tried lots of other sorts of Christian church, Anglican, Methodist, Baptist, the whole lot. But none had that indefinable something. I didn't fit in, and none of them had that something that hit me every time I went into a Catholic church. And when I finally plucked up courage to visit the local Catholic church, there it was again, that something. 1989 saw a major change in my fortunes. I'd known Colin Hart, who's here with me now, for a few years. He'd taken a year out of university to work for Spark. And he drove me around to speaking engagements, and we became good friends. And in 1989, he offered to come to Dorset and for us to go together to Lourdes again. I'd wanted to go there again since my first visit. In fact, as soon as I got back from the first visit, I wanted to go again. So we were to be away for 2 weeks, and then he would go back to Sheffield, which is about 250 miles from Dorset, and he'd continue his university course. We had another wonderful time in Lourdes, and most importantly, I think for the first time, I learned about the wonderful possibility of offering up suffering to God as a prayer, and I finally also began to understand the special something I'd encountered in Catholic churches, that it wasn't a what, it was a who. It was Jesus, of course, made present in the Eucharist. So when we got back to Dorset, Colin said he would stay a few days, just till I settled back. And those days turned into weeks, turned into months, turned into years. And, well, suffice it to say, 20 years have passed since he first came for 2 weeks. He's now my assistant, my carer, my best friend. He says he's still saving up for the fare back to Sheffield. I learned a lot about the Catholic faith from Colin, and I decided I had to join. I couldn't. There was nowhere else to run. I had to join. 31st of March 1991 saw me join the Catholic Church. A really, really full of joy day. And in the 18 years since I became a Catholic, I've learned a lot of things about the truth and beauty of the faith. Learned that it doesn't matter what my failings are or what the failings of anyone else are. No matter how easy or difficult it is to love God or one's neighbour. No matter how difficult it is to go to church, and sometimes it is. Nevertheless, the fullness of the truth lies in our church. As I said, there's nowhere else to run. The truth is here, and we can't go anywhere else. I also learned that my suffering and all suffering has a purpose, and the uniting my sufferings with those of Christ on the cross and offering them up to God in heaven was a way of showing my love to Jesus, and the most powerful prayer I can offer for myself, for other people, and for suffering people. I honestly do believe that suffering is a share in the sufferings of our Lord himself, and therefore the greatest privilege possible in the world we live in. I'll talk later about some of the physical and mental sufferings that I undergo on a daily basis. One of the acute sufferings I've had, however, since I became a Catholic, is that I've experienced a lot of difficulty in churches, and it's very sad. Sometimes there are pews or benches and there's nowhere for a wheelchair user to sit, no space. And sometimes, wherever I go, I've been told I'm in the way. My local Catholic church told me that I was a health and safety hazard, that I was a fire risk. I'm going to spontaneously combust, I don't know. So it's strange, that both the priest and many of the people knew, but they were unwilling, or they didn't do anything. The problem remains in that church. And in other churches I've been to as well, big problems with where I'm going to go. You're in the way, you can't sit there, you're in the way. And that's the sadness, because it drives disabled people out, and we should be bringing them in. Sick and disabled people need the church just as much as anybody who considers themselves well and healthy, probably more so. And we ought to be bringing them in, making sure there's ramps and places to sit, and that they're welcomed. Not asked what's wrong with you, but welcomed into the church. So that suffering also has a purpose and can be offered up, and I don't discount that at all. What I do know is that when I feel pretty much at the margins of the church, and I do very often, couldn't be in better company, could I? Because our Saviour was the most marginalised of all. So we who are the marginalised people are, in a sense, the closest to him. Another particularly beautiful lesson I've learned is the whole truth about the infinite value of every human being, be they the greatest or what John Paul II called the last and the least. The tiny seed of this profound revelation was sown in my parents' church, developed, interestingly, during my years as a pro-life atheist, and finally brought home to me in its full, amazing Christian fullness only months after I joined the church. To explain it, I need to go back a bit and start by acknowledging the truth that God can use every weakness we have for his glory. And it's easiest to explain that truth by reference to a subject the complete ignorance of which is one of the many disabilities I have besides spina bifida, maths. I am talent-free at maths. I have no ability whatsoever. I have no idea of what is a likely answer. Absolutely useless. Had to retake maths public exam so many times that the teacher became a really good friend of mine. I'm still in touch with her now. That's a long time. And the only concept she managed to instill into me, in all those interminable maths lessons, was the concept of infinity. But anyway, I'm glad she did that. And I'm sure everyone here understands infinity, if only because nobody could be worse at maths than I was. And of course, infinity is always implicit in itself, can't be added to, can't be subtracted to, can't be multiplied or divided, can't be split up. So each individually valuable thing has a bit of infinity. If someone or something has infinite value, then two things with infinite value can't be worth twice as much. No such thing as twice infinity. Infinity remains always the same, and the most that any individual or group of individuals can be equal to is infinity. And each individual human being has this infinite value. And since infinity can't be multiplied or divided, each individual human being is as valuable as all the rest put together. Each one individual, the smallest, the weakest, is as valuable as the greatest and the most powerful in the world. And since every human being is made of the image of God, God would have paid the same price for one as for all, the same price for the same infinite value. Because of the infinite value, 1 minute of life is as precious as 100 years. After all, how could 100 years be precious if the minutes and hours and days that made it up were not also precious? A short life is as valuable as a long one. A profoundly disabled life as precious as a Olympic athlete, shall we say. And I was taught the fullness of this truth in a very singular way. Colin and I spent Christmas of 1991, my first Christmas as a Catholic, in Calcutta, the poorest city in India, Mother Teresa's city, learning to love the poorest of the poor. And we spent some time at her home for the dying. Christmas Day, we spent at the home for the dying. When I left, I asked God for a good memory. I have a terrible memory. And I asked for a good memory so I would never forget the people I met there. One in particular I wanted to remember. As we were walking along the street one day, a very dusty, dirty street, full of people, absolutely thronged with people, I happened to look down, I'm sure it was no happenstance, and I noticed a baby. Well, nothing unusual there. Calcutta's full of babies. Every street is full of babies being carried by their mothers. This baby, though, was a new addition to a family of pavement dwellers, people who live and die on the streets. They have only a bit of the pavement to call their home, while the richer people just ignore them, step over them, walk by. And this baby was the tiniest baby I've ever seen. Don't suppose he was bigger than my outstretched hand. And he moved very little, didn't cry at all. And his parents and 2 other children were all dressed literally in rags with nothing warm, even though for Calcutta December is a cold month. The baby was so tiny and weak it seemed absolutely incredible that he'd survived at all, or likely that he would continue to survive. But the family had covered this tiniest of children with the nicest, the thickest, the warmest of the rags they had. They stroked him, they whispered to him in between, begging from passers-by for the few grains of rice that would constitute their meal for that day. They loved him genuinely, wholeheartedly, couldn't do anything, couldn't contribute anything, just lying there, but they appreciated his unique preciousness. And at that moment I recalled a passage from Isaiah, paraphrased by Mother Teresa, appropriately in Calcutta. She said, "I have called you by your name, you are mine. Water will not drown you, fire will not burn you. I will give up nations for you. You are precious to me, I love you." And it's this sentence, "I'll give up nations for you," that seems to me to jump out. It seems to me that this is God saying he would put aside, for the moment, the interests of vast numbers of other people, equally precious people, but for this one child. It's God saying that vast numbers of other people won't satisfy me if this one is lost. And it's God saying this one is as valuable to me, as precious to me, as all the others put together. And this is what I think the pavement family in Calcutta were saying to their weakest, most vulnerable child. This is what the church teaches, and this is what we have to say to profoundly disabled people and their families who don't speak, don't move, don't seem to contribute much. And we have several such people in No Less Human. We think of them as our most important members because they proclaim the pro-life message by their very existence. We need also to remember the infinite value of those in the ill-named persistent vegetative state, also profoundly valuable people, precious people, just as valuable as all of us put together. All the ones our society labels worthless, we're the ones who put first, and we have to be seen to put them first, speak it out from the rooftops, if they're accessible. So my third change of mind, and I'm just going to have couple of drinks before I get on to the third change of mind. My third change of mind was on the subject of euthanasia and assisted suicide. I've suffered a lot of pain throughout my life. I now need increasing doses of morphine because my spine is collapsing and trapping nerves as it goes. The pain can be very bad. When it's at its worst, I can't move, think or speak, and it can go on for a very long time. There's no prospect of relief. In fact, the doctors think it will get worse. So I'm making the most of it while I can in travelling and coming to see you. During the years 1985 to 1995, starting with being abandoned by my husband, I lived through obviously the most difficult period of my life, and I've already spoken about some of the implications of that time. In 1985, when I was at my lowest ebb, I decided I no longer wanted to live. And at the time, doctors thought my life expectancy was very short. Over time, my desire to die became a settled wish. It lasted for 10 years, over 10 years actually. And during the first 5 of those years, I attempted suicide several times. Some were, I suppose, just cries for help, really, not serious. I'd cut my wrists enough to bleed, but not to be serious. My friends went through the house removing sharp objects, and I can still remember through the mental haze eating my boiled potatoes with a spoon because all the knives have been removed. But despite this, I continued to find ways to hurt myself. And there were several very serious suicide attempts when I meant to succeed. One particularly sticks in my mind, so I'll tell you about that one. I'd taken a large overdose of painkillers. I cut my wrists very badly with an old rusty penknife that had escaped the general removal of sharp objects. I found it in the back of a drawer. I then drank a whole bottle of martini, cuddled my favourite teddy bear, lay down in bed and waited to die. Unfortunately for me, though, at the time I thought most unfortunately, my friend Sue arrived. She was able to let herself into my house, and she found I was losing consciousness, and she called the emergency services. And I was taken to hospital, where I was treated against my will. The doctors said they must have my permission to treat me, to pump my stomach, to treat my wrists, which were bleeding profusely. And I refused. I said no. And they said, if we don't do it, you'll die. And I just laughed. I said, yeah, I know, that's what I want. So they waited till I lost consciousness and then did it anyway. But if euthanasia had been legal, if assisted suicide had been legal, their hands would have been tied. They couldn't have treated me. In fact, under the Mental Capacity Act, now in force in the UK, if I had written an advance directive or living will saying I didn't want treatment, their hands would also have been tied. They couldn't have treated me, and I wouldn't be here now speaking with you. At that time, I would have satisfied all the supposedly strict criteria that apply in places where euthanasia is legal. For instance, Switzerland, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the US states of Oregon and Washington. Because I had a settled wish to die, I had pain that was unbearable, and it pretty much was. Pretty much still is, except now I'm able to bear it. And a life that was considered, life expectancy considered very short. But interestingly, in some of the places where assisted suicide and euthanasia are legal, people are only given a 2-week cooling off period during which they're allowed to change their mind and say, after all, they want to live. That would not have saved me 2 weeks to change your mind. I wanted to die for 10 years. If euthanasia had been legal at that time, I would have requested it, no hesitation at all. If I could have travelled to a facility in Switzerland known as Dignitas, which is a suicide facility. People go there and they are killed by the staff there, called Dignitas, a most unfortunate name. But of course I would have gone there if it had taken that. looking back, it hardly makes much sense to me, and so I don't suppose it will to you, that although I'd become a Catholic, I still wanted to die, and I think it was just that I couldn't bear my life as it was, couldn't bear it. It was in the time before Colin had come, couldn't see a way forward. My mind was in turmoil. I had difficulties within churches for the reasons I've spoken of, wasn't getting much support, had no support outside. I'd go to bed every night and hope I wouldn't wake up. I'd even pray. I'd say, please God, take me tonight, don't let me see the morning. After I became a Catholic, I didn't actively try to commit suicide again. I knew that was wrong. But I still desperately wanted my life to end. Of course, being a Catholic doesn't remove our problems. It doesn't. It helps us to bear them, whether they're physical, mental, emotional, social, whatever. Helps us to live with them and offer them up. But sometimes it takes time to do that. And it took my friends, and particularly Colin, many, many years to help me approach the future with the kind of assurance God gives us. Not of an easier life, but of a life geared towards eternal happiness with Him. And their efforts and a trip to India in 1995 helped turn my life around. In 1995, Colin and I visited a small project in India for disabled children. The children were very disabled, some of them only able to crawl in the dust, but they loved me overwhelmingly, wholeheartedly. They hugged me, they called me mummy, and we actually subsequently set up a charity for them. And the night after leaving the project, I said to Colin, you know, I think I want to live after all. And it was the first time I'd thought that for over 10 years. And in retrospect, I think that I was lucky to have those two aspects, my friends and the children who gave me a reason to look outwards rather than inwards, a reason to do something for somebody else rather than look inwards to myself. And I think that's euthanasia is a problem because it fails to realise the question of hope. Hope. Everyone can be given hope. If I'd been killed then, nobody would ever have known that the future held not only good times, but actually the best years of my life. And that the doctors were wrong in saying my life expectancy was very short. The choice of an assisted death assumes life will never get better, and it can, and it does. So, nearly coming up to the present time. In 2006, in the run-up to a bill in the House of Lords in the UK to legalise assisted suicide for terminally ill people, I did a lot of radio and TV interviews, as many of us did in the pro-life movement and Let Us Human. I've forgotten them all except one. That one was called Radio Northampton. And I remember it for two reasons. Firstly, the interviewer was very rude, very offensive, didn't listen to what I said, and didn't want to know, was very clearly in favour of assisted suicide. Secondly, I spoke very badly. I was very tired, but that's no excuse. I just didn't speak well. And I thought I hadn't put over what I wanted to say at all well, and that nobody would at all be convinced. I put the phone down because it was an interview from home, and less than 20 minutes she phoned me and she said she wanted to apologise for the interviewer's behaviour. So, okay, that's good. But 15 minutes after that she phoned again. She said a lot of people had phoned in, and amongst them was a young man who said his name was John. He had that very day decided to take his own life, but after hearing what I said, he decided after all he wouldn't do it. Now that absolutely was not due to any merit on my part, because I felt I'd spoken very badly. But somehow God had transformed my stumbling, inadequate words and made them into a message of hope for this young man, John. And often all that desperate people, whether they are disabled, terminally ill or not, need is to be given hope, told there is hope for the future, that we will help you, we will support you. What they definitely don't need is to be told they're right to feel so unhappy, they would be better off dead, and, well, I think that's the equivalent of seeing somebody about to jump off a high bridge and pushing them over. And in fact, that happened. You know, some people think this is just an anecdote. In China, in May this year, a man was threatening to jump off a high bridge, and the police and the emergency services were there, and the tailback of traffic was 5 hours long because this man was threatening and then didn't. And then one man got out of a car at the front of the queue, went up to the man as if to shake his hand, and pushed him off the bridge. Now, fortunately, the would-be suicide survived, and I think he needs our prayers. But that's the equivalent. If we say we will take people at their word when they say they want to die, if they're sick or disabled, we are doing the same thing as that man who pushed the suicide off the bridge. So to finish, a couple of years ago I read a booklet by a young British medical doctor, James Casson. He was dying of cancer, and he called his book Dying, the Greatest Adventure of My Life. And I think there's a place also for a book called something like Living, the Greatest Adventure There Is. Because my life has been, okay, full of pain and suffering, that's true. But it's also been full of highs and lows, great highs. And I feel I'm now living the best years. And I think my eventual death will also be an adventure when it comes. But of course now I'm content to let it happen naturally. Wait for that adventure to come to me in its own time naturally. Because I want to live now. So that's what